Howdy.
Hello.
Do we need this, Barbara, at all?
No, I think we're using these.
Do we need these? We do need them.
Oh, we need both? Ah. Okay. Let me see if I can manage all this.
I'm gonna look like I have a green tennis ball in my mouth.
Or a lime sherbet ice cream cone, depending on how you look at it. Right, now can you hear? Okay, great. The reason I asked is that we are recording this because we can't actually live stream it from the church, but we can record it and post it later. So if you miss anything or if you know anybody that wasn't able to attend tonight, you can direct them to either our Facebook or our YouTube channel. How many of you are aware that we do stream our events? Most of you? And CJ and I have been together for all 25 Joe Pickett books, this being the 25th. And most of them, you can go back and find them. If you go to YouTube, is the easiest way, and then you look for not Joe Pickett, well, you could maybe, CJ Box at Poison Pen, and they will magically turn up. Plus there are audio of all of this. So unfortunately, we have left a long digital trail.
Yes, and we were trying to figure out last night, I think with the other books, the Cassie Dual books and the standalones, I think I've been here 32 times over the last 25 years at Barbara's store with every single book.
Now, the biggest attraction is clearly all of you, okay? But the other attraction is that we do a restaurant crawl. So we have been in the last 2 nights to 2 new restaurants that CJ loves. And part of my job is to figure out where we're gonna have dinner as part of this whole deal. So we've done pretty well.
Yeah, oh, yes, we love all those places.
Right, plus it's not Wyoming in February, which is another key
That's
reason.
right.
But CJ, to be fair, has actually been here in August, haven't you?
I have, yes. Hope to not do that again.
Well, it's kind of in your control. So anyway, this is really a special Joe Pickett. Well, they're all special, but the fact that it's the 25th. Why is it that we attach sort of value to numbers? Why do you think that is?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Why do we attach value to numbers? Why would Joe Pickett 25 be any more special than Joe Pickett 24?
Oh, well, 'cause I never thought there'd be a Joe Pickett number 2. That's why.
I did.
I did not. It's one, it's hard for me to believe that the series is 25 books. And when I started with a book open season, I was telling, I thought, a standalone story about a contemporary issue, which was Endangered Species Act, and how well-meaning legislation goes awry on the ground as a kind of a new Wild West story. I never thought this is the first book in a series. I never thought, the world's just waiting for a Wyoming game warden series. And it wasn't until Penguin Putnam, the publisher, accepted the book and offered a contract with 2 more with Joe Pickett did I ever think about a series.
So I've told CJ this, but sometimes there's a disconnect between the publisher and the author. So when CJ's book was approved, open season, and they bought it, his editor wrote me a long and moving email in which he said, here's this great talent, and here is a book that, not like anything you've ever read before, and we expect you to do amazing things for the book. So I knew from the beginning that Joe Pickett was going to be a success.
I didn't, and I don't know, what's it? Yeah, I don't know if you remember at the time, there was a small group of independent bookstore owners. Otto Penzler, I'm trying to think of the guy's name in LA, the LA Mystery Bookstore.
Right.
One in
there was one in Washington.
San Francisco.
There were about 30 mystery bookstores.
And all these independent bookstores all got together, probably at Barbara's instigation, and started talking about this new book. And I didn't know the book world or anything at all, but I'd say that was the real launch. That's what got a lot of attention with that new book, was people like yourself saying this is something new and different, and made a lot of difference in the end. I didn't realize at the time what was going on.
Well, what you also didn't realize is that Think about this. I have written a newsletter to you every single month since November of 1989. I have never missed a month. Very few bookstores actually do that. So, well, thank you. Very nice. But so what CJ doesn't know is that many of the bookstores just stole our stuff. They would write, some of them actually asked was if it was okay if they just copied our newsletter, but some of them just did it anyway. So you're right, it was actually a propulsive kind of a thing. If we liked it, then the general rule was that they liked it.
And it certainly got a lot of attention, that first book. It was, I think it won more best first novel awards than any one since.
It did really well, although you didn't win your Edgar until you wrote Blue Heaven.
That was that was Blue Heaven. I was nominated but did not win. And but it also was a New York Times notable book and got a lot of attention that you don't expect a first novel to get. And what was so amazing to me was that this was a book, open season, that had been bouncing around New York for 5 years before it was published. I had an agent. Have I ever told you this story? I had an agent. I had never met this agent, but he claimed he was really good. And this was pre-internet, pre-email, pre-everything. I had to physically send the book to this guy. And for 4 years, I would call him, and he was very brusque, very New Yorky, brusque, mean. Say, I can't sell this thing. It doesn't quite fit into a genre. Set in a part of the world nobody knows. Quit calling me, basically. If something happens, I'll let you know. I'm not withholding information. So I said, okay, I don't know how this publishing world works, but I guess I've got to be more patient. So 4 years went by, nothing happened, and I went to a writers' conference in Denver where you could pitch, called the Rocky Mountain Gold Writers Conference, where you can kind of pitch your book and your story to editors and agents that they bring in. And I was meeting with an agent, and I told him, I said, I've got this book. It's actually done, but I told him what it was about, and he said, that sounds very interesting. And he said, do you have an agent? And I said, yes. And he said, what's your name? And what's his name? And I told him, and he said, you don't know he's dead, do you? And he'd been dead for like 9 months at that point, and nobody in their agency, nobody's bothered to let me know that. But of course, the story got around this conference, that really fast. And Martha Bushko was a 24-year-old editor from Penguin Putnam, given the right to acquire a book for the first time, heard the story about this guy from Wyoming with a dead agent, and wanted to see the manuscript, and that's how it happened.
Amazing. Who knew that your agent was more effective in the grave than
he was not effective at all. And what the dark part of this story is, after the books got published and I started going to New York regularly, I never met with an editor who ever saw the manuscript. They never was sent to anybody. So,
which might explain the 4-year silence.
Yes.
Right. Well, anyway, as it all turned out, open season was a big success. Remind us, what was the endangered little animal? Because it wasn't like the rhinoceros in Wyoming.
It was called a miller's weasel in the book, and they did that in the TV show too. But it's based on a black-footed ferret, which is a real creature that was thought extinct possibly in Wyoming. And there used to be little posters around. If you see this animal, call this number. And I grew up with that in high school, seeing these little caricatures of this animal. And then when the huge colony was found of these black-footed ferrets outside the town of Meeteetse, I found it very interesting that everybody in that town knew they were there and nobody made that call all those years. And so that was the impetus for the first book.
Right. So let's talk about Battle Mountain, the
Sure.
25th book. And we have to go back to Nate Romanowski and events that tragically overtook Nate.
Right. In 3-Inch Teeth, the last book, the end of the book, something horrible happens. And that is, a major character is murdered, and that's Nate's wife in front of their baby. And so I think anybody who read that end of last book knows that Nate is going to become unhinged and go after the bad guy. And that's Battle Mountain.
It is Battle Mountain. So you you like killing off major characters from time to time. Is that to keep readers on their toes? We don't want you to get complacent.
That's right. I think it's important that, that you don't, for the reader not to just assume that everybody is safe and that everything will go happily ever after. And because I think that's real life. But I think it puts tension into the books that may not otherwise be there when you know that something bad can happen to good people.
So, I mean, poor Nate. Nate has had, a really horrible ride with you, but briefly he was happy. Briefly he had a wife and a baby. And
right.
You took it all away.
Yeah, it's been an interesting story arc because he was such a basic kind of primal character. And then, slowly, like you said, slowly kind of came back on the grid, got married, opened a small business, had a little baby, got a cell phone, and then, but this book strips him right back down to his most primal, and that's something I wanted to do. And he finds, Nate, after the opening chapter or so, that he needs to reconnect with the old Nate himself because he's lost his edge, and that's how the book begins.
Yeah, well, there's a great opening scene, so, it's not a spoiler to say that Nate is stalking up a river, right?
Right, the body count begins, yes.
Yeah, and he thinks that Axel, the really bad guy, is holed up in a cabin, and he's wrong. So from there, we go on, and Nate really spirals even further down as a consequence, but then this great new character, Geronimo Jones, fellow falconer, appears. I like Geronimo, so I hope you're going to give him an expanded role.
He's a fun character to write. Yeah, like you say, he's a fellow falconer, fellow special forces officer, member, lives in Colorado. And in this case, Geronimo finds where Nate has been holing up for months and urges him to join with Geronimo to both go after Axel Soledad, because Geronimo's had a near miss in his life too, thanks to Axel. So the two of them, with all of their hardware, started trek. They were hunting Axel Soledad first in through the Yellowstone Park into Montana, and then slowly across the state of Wyoming from north to south. Leading to a real location called Battle Mountain in south central Wyoming, where a lot of action takes place. And meanwhile, at the same time they're doing that, Joe Pickett gets an assignment from the governor to go find the governor's son-in-law, who's gone missing he's an elk hunting guide. And the governor wants Joe to find his son-in-law very quickly so that the governor doesn't have to confess to his daughter and wife that he was the one who persuaded the son-in-law to go on this hunting trip, and he doesn't want to be in trouble. So Joe tries to wrap that up very quickly, and where this hunting guide went missing was around Battle Mountain. So there's two parallel stories going that will eventually lead them together.
So, detouring back slightly, tell me about the weapon that Nate, because you showed it to me at dinner, and it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, Nate carries. He's carried a couple different guns, but primarily through the series, he packs a .454 Casull handgun. It's a five round handgun. At one time, it was considered the most powerful handgun in the world. Now it's disputed. There's other manufacturers, but it's just an awesome weapon that's very, very powerful. It's the only. We're talking at dinner tonight. The Secret Service buys these .454 Casulls because it's the only handgun that will kill a car. If a car is coming straight toward the president, you can shoot into the front of the car. The bullet will go through the engine block and kill the driver. That's how much power it has. So Nate is a master with that, and carries it with him all the time.
It has a sinisterly long barrel. It doesn't look like an ordinary handgun.
No, it's not as big physically as you might imagine. The reason I said the manufacturer Freedom Arms last year gave me one finally, an engraved pistol.
A $3,500 gift.
Yeah, but
Product placement is alive and well.
They've sold so many of those guns due to the books that he felt like he owed it to me.
Did you?
I've fired it a few times.
Did you have to declare it on your taxes?
I did not even think about that, Barbara.
Right, sorry. Shouldn't have raised it. But I mean, I think that's interesting that you can, without intentionally, because CJ is actually not a guy who would deliberately do product placement for advancement, but it would be so powerful that it would actually raise sales for this company.
Yes, it's quite a weapon. But at the time I introduced the character of Nate Romanowski, I just wanted to make him larger than life, and I did a search, the most powerful handgun, and it came up that it was the .454 Casull made in Freedom, Wyoming, and I thought, perfect, it's Freedom, Wyoming is a little tiny town almost into Idaho in that part of the state.
Oh, that actually was perfect, right. So talking about Battle Mountain, the whole scenario that you envision, which is a small town with an incredibly luxurious and private resort not too far away, and a small airport that is really just designed for private planes.
Right.
Okay, I've been to visit you.
Yes, you have.
It's actually where you live, right?
That's where I live,
But
yes.
you decided to call it something else.
Yeah, I decided to call the town where I live is outside of Saratoga, Wyoming. In the book, it's called Warm Springs, which was the original name of the town. But yeah, that's something that happens every year in real life, has for over 50 years, and that is in September, all of these private jets, sometimes big jets, fly into this airport. It's the third largest airport in Wyoming and doesn't have any commercial flights out of it. But all these jets show up, and little jets park under the wings of big jets, and they pack the airport. And it's all CEOs of the defense industry and aeronautics industry and military-industrial complex primarily. And they all get together and go out to this very remote dude ranch where they all play cowboy for 4 days. And they meet, and they're members, and there's only so many members of this club. And the joke has always been where I live, one well-placed bomb at this ranch would just devastate the military-industrial complex of the U.S., which is true, but I've kept that in mind for over 40 years as the subject of a book. I changed the name of the group, I changed the name of the town, but it's all kind of based on something that really happened.
So I actually thought when I was reading the book that he was taking Jackson, Wyoming, where there is an annual, very exclusive and incredibly expensive group of people, but they're mostly bankers, aren't they, and financial people. They're not the...
Yeah, that's the Federal Reserve that meets in Jackson every year.
Well, they don't actually meet in Jackson. They meet up closer
in Grand
to
Teton,
the
Grand
Grand
Teton Park.
Tetons, and I've hiked around the Grand Tetons twice now, and you can't go near the place where this all occurs. But that's what I thought you were aiming for.
Yeah, this other group that I'm talking about is fairly out. It's kind of interesting. I've always thought this little town, everybody knows this group exists, and every year when they show up, nobody ever talks about it. They don't want to. So I write a book about it for thousands of people to read, but no one ever talks about it or refers to them. That's just something that happens, and they give them their privacy.
Is there a certain dress-up element to this group, or can you?
Oh yeah, they dress up like cowboys, or they pull their new Orvis fly fishing clothes out of the bag and wear that on the river, that kind of thing.
So these are like Washington and New York guys out there playing in their Carhartts.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And their wives are there as well. It's not all a men's club, but it used to be just a men's club.
So if you live up the road, have you ever actually gone down there?
I have. I've been there. I was there for one of their initiations. When a member dies, they initiate a new person who's in the defense industry of some kind, and they go through a big candle-lit, or torch-lit, I should say, ceremony to induct the new member, or 2 or 3 every year.
Well, this reminded me slightly of the Detection Club, which in Great Britain, the British Crime Writers Association is their business-like organization, like the Mystery Writers of America. But the Detection Club is a private club, membership by invitation only, and they have a really fabulous ritual. And I've been lucky enough to attend 2 or 3 of their meetings as a guest. And at the one where they initiated the chairman, one chairman back, they actually have a skull. And they come in and there's, all kinds of stuff, and then the new guy has to put his hand on the skull and swear all this stuff. I thought it was a plastic skull, but it turns out it's a real skull, and only recently, given forensic examination, that they determined that the skull was not Eric, but Erica, which I absolutely love. So I thought about that when you were mentioning it. It's surprising how many adult groups there are that basically are like Comic-Con, cosplay and fancy stuff. I just loved it.
I do too.
Right. So anyway, we have two converging things going on here. We have Nate and Geronimo, but then we have Joe. But you introduce yet another new character in this book, a woman who's a ranger. So tell us about her. And I hope she's a keeper and you won't kill her in the next book.
Yeah, Joe, when he arrives in the Battle Mountain area, because that's not his district, he immediately meets up with the local game warden, who's a woman game warden. There's only 3 of them in Wyoming in real life, but in my book she's there, named Susan Kany. And because it's her territory, he and she work together. And there's an interesting dynamic, I think, in that is that Joe realizes this game warden is about the age of his daughters. And she says things to him that his daughters would say to him, and he starts to feel really old. And he also feels bad because he can't really reveal why he's there, because the governor's asked him to keep everything confidential. So that creates some sparks. But I like how their relationship goes and builds too.
I think it's a great relationship. I don't think his knees are quite as good as hers.
What's that?
I don't think his knees are quite as good as her knees.
Oh, no, that's right.
Shows up when you're climbing, right?
Yep.
There we go. So thinking back to Nate and the fact that he's once again fallen off the grid and is on this, if I remember right, Sheridan, Joe's oldest daughter of 3, is running what was Nate's and probably still is Nate's falcon business.
That's right. It's called Yarok Enterprises.
Okay, but there's potential there for Sheridan to have a much larger role in her job as master falconer than she's had in previous books. I know you don't play in your books, but do you sort of seed that in there to think about maybe Sheridan doing something?
Yeah, she's gonna. I don't want to give too much away, but in the next book, next year's book, not only will Sheridan be very much featured in it, but so will the other 2 daughters. It's kind of a very different book, and it's more about the girls than Joe or Nate or Mary Beth, and it's something I've wanted to do for a long time.
Well, Sheridan's had an interesting story arc throughout, all 25 books, and it would be sort of great to see her come into her own as kind of an equal.
Yeah, and Sheridan was 7 years old in the very first book, open season. So the books have all taken place in real time, and now I believe, I might have this wrong, but I think she's 26. I know for sure, but I just can't remember. I'd have to look it up. Just like a couple of years ago, I didn't realize, it was, I think 4 years ago, I started starting a new book, and all of a sudden I thought, I don't know how old Joe Pickett is. So I had to go back to the very first book. There's one mention in there that he is 34. So then I had to go book by book, because some books take a year, some are 4 months, some are 6 months, and figured out at that time he was 49. Now he's 51 in this book. Now I know how old he is. And I'll continue to do that in real time.
You're going to need to slow him down, though, or pretty soon it won't be credible for him to doing stuff.
Well, it may not be credible for me to keep writing the books at that point.
Well,
I think I'll be ready to retire when Joe Pickett is ready to retire.
Well, you can sit at a desk better than he can climb a mountain. Come on. Right. So let's talk about your other series, because I don't think we've had a big conversation about Cassie Duell, and she moved to Montana as a private investigator 2 books ago, right?
Correct. Yep.
And I thought, I love Montana. I think it's great that CJ is writing Montana, but Cassie is a really terrific character. Why did you decide to make her a private eye?
Because I'd always wanted to write a PI book, and in the first few books she was a deputy sheriff,
right? And
wanted to go off on her own. And I think every mystery writer wants to do private eye kind of book where the cases come in, and I enjoy that. And the last book was called Treasure State. It took place primarily in Butte and Anaconda, Montana. For those who know Montana, a really interesting part of the state. And I have an idea for another Cassie book, but I have not yet started it, simply because, more than one book a year is tough. And for a long time there, I was on a book and a half a year pace, and I've slowed down a little bit. But I do have an idea for another Cassie one that I might start.
Well, I mentioned it because, as soon as you get through with Joe Pickett, you have to wait till next year for book 26. If you haven't read these two Cassie duels, I really recommend them. I think there are many of those same features, and it's great to read about Montana, which is adjacent, but also different. And there's some very good history in Treasure State. One, do any of you remember Forrest Fenn and that big treasure hunt that he set up here in the West? And eventually somebody found it, but people died, if I remember right, looking for it.
Yeah, I think there was at least 8 people who died looking for it.
Right, he buried what was it, like $1 million? It wasn't a monster sum. He was a gallery owner in Santa Fe. The first time I went to Santa Fe in 1974, I went to Forrest Fenn's gallery, and it's a beautiful house in Santa Fe with a garden, and it's very, very fancy. But eventually, he sold it to somebody else and kind of to Nedra, and sort of retired. But to keep relevant, he decided he would put $1 million worth of, I don't think it was money. I think it was
gold coins and jewelry.
Right, yeah, that you could actually bury and expect to survive in the wilderness. So he went out and buried it, and then told everybody that it was out there.
And there was a lot of speculation that maybe he didn't really didn't really hide it. He put out this poem, supposedly, that if you could interpret the poem, you could figure out where it was. And did it was found? Mm-hmm. It was found in Wyoming, actually.
Right. But anyway, CJ stole that whole story and put it in, well, sorry, I shouldn't say stole, was inspired by the same story.
Yep.
And put it in Treasure State. But the other thing that's really interesting to me about Treasure State is that it was in Butte, Montana, that there was a lot of early union organizing because the copper mining industry was so dangerous.
Yep, and I love the location on that. That's a fascinating part of Montana with Butte and Anaconda. And it was actually where the American labor movement started, was Montana, because of the really tough relations between the mine owners and the miners.
Yeah, you might think it was in the Gary steel mills or back in the Pennsylvania coal mines or something, but it was actually in Wyoming. So the advantage to writing a PI, it seems to me, is that they are not constrained by the rules and the ethics of law enforcement. Or in Joe's case, there's, in theory, there are at least ethics and rules for Wyoming game wardens.
Right, and they also don't have to answer to superiors. And in Cassie's case, it's her agency, and she can take the cases that she wants. And there are several in Treasure State that were fun to do. One of them, this kind of goes back to the Forrest Fenn thing, is that she surmises that the person who wrote this poem must be a writer. So that's one of my favorite parts of the book, is she goes around to all the local writers and interviews them. And I make these writers idiots. And it's kind of fun to do. I kind of based a lot of them on people I've met, and book fairs and stuff, who talk a great game but don't really do anything. And that was fun for me to write.
It's also true that Montana has an unusually high population of writers. So, and Phoenix doesn't. I'm still baffled by why in this big city we have so few, it's growing, but we have so few writers. And then Boston, Massachusetts, or, the Twin Cities, or Montana.
I once met
littered with writers.
A great mystery writer named James Crumley. I know you know who he is. And I couldn't wait to meet him, and I finally met him. I found out which bar he went to every night in Missoula, and he sits on the end, and I went and sat next to him, and he'd actually read the book I just wrote, and he was very complimentary of that. And and I said, I'm from Wyoming. We really don't have any writers like you do in Montana. And he goes, yeah, in Montana, you could throw a stick and hit a rider. And I wish more people would throw sticks.
Yeah, well, there you are. Maybe, I would have argued once upon a time that if you lived in a remote place, you didn't have anything else to do, but Wyoming is a remote place, and yet you don't have a superpopulation of writers.
No, 600,000 people. But we have quite a few writers now. It's
more. Some of
it's
whom
cheap, I think.
Some of whom moved in. There's a scene in this book in a place called Thai Siding, where I won't mention who they are, but a couple of really famous thriller writers and a slightly less famous historical fiction writer lived near there. And I once left CJ's house and drove across the mountains in a blizzard on Memorial Day. And my husband said, we didn't put snow tires on the car. Why are we driving over this mountain range? But anyway, we survived it. And the difference between eastern Wyoming and Thai Siding and Saratoga, Wyoming is profound.
It is, yeah. It's at least a lot more desolate in Thai Siding at first, till you get up into the trees and you realize how it's really beautiful up there.
Well, one thing that's happening in Wyoming is what happened here in Scottsdale. Most of you probably realize that Scottsdale has been built largely on annexing ranches. So, there's McCormick Ranch and there's this ranch or whatever, and so developers buy a ranch. And then that's why our zoning is so weird here, because it's not uniform. It's just a big patchwork of zoning. Mm-hmm. And that is happening in Wyoming too, isn't it? That people are buying ranches and then can develop them.
Yep, Montana too. Yeah, and we don't have as much development as Montana does, for example, or Idaho, for that matter. And I think it's just because our weather is a little more extreme than both those places. But yeah, there's definitely growth. It's just not big explosive growth, which is fine. Although during COVID, every single house in my valley was purchased by somebody, sometimes over the phone, and people have moved in and now they're trying to catch up with housing.
Does Wyoming still have the smallest population of any state?
Yep, it does.
Which still entitles you to 2 senators.
We've got 2 senators, but only 1 congressman. Yes.
Right, just thought I'd mention that. Right, so let me think, what else could we talk about? What do you want to talk about?
I don't know, you want to take some questions?
We could do that. Yeah. You could do that, you get to pick people. And
sure.
You should repeat the question because otherwise the microphone won't pick it up.
I'll do that, yeah, if anybody's got questions. Yes, sir?
Bomber Mountain, are you familiar with that?
With Bomber Mountain? Where the B-52 crashed into the mountain in wasn't that the snow? That was the Medicine Bow Peak, I believe. Yep, I'm familiar with that. Did I pass that test?
Well, it wasn't a test, but I thought that perhaps Battle Mountain was kind of a takeoff on Bomber Mountain.
No, Battle Mountain is a real place. You can find it on the map. It's in southern Wyoming. It's called Battle Mountain because in the 1830s, a group of mountain men were trapping in the area, and they got into a big fight with American Indians. And the Indians laid siege to their camp for a few days, killed a few of them, but a few of the trappers managed to escape and get down the mountain into the valley, and they referred to it as Battle Mountain, and it's still got that name. Great name. I've been wanting to call a book Battle Mountain for about 15 years, and this time I could do it.
What mountain range is it?
That's part of the Sierra Madre range in southern Wyoming.
Okay.
Yes, sir, in the back.
I asked you last year if Missy will ever get her just desserts.
No,
Thank
and I
you.
think I probably answered, she's too mean to die. I'm sorry? Yeah, she didn't appear in this book, but she's going to appear whenever Joe's life is the most stressful. That's when she'll show up. Yes, sir.
Are you going to let your, I shouldn't say your, are you going to let Joe's daughter's boyfriend survive?
No, that's kind of a wish fulfillment thing, I've got 3 daughters, so there's a few of them I would like to be chomped on by grizzly bears and some of those guys that came around. They're now all married and all the sons-in-law are great, but all dads kind of have those thoughts, I think, at times. So I don't know, maybe I'll take it easy on them. Yes, sir.
A couple of your books make reference to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
The Upper Peninsula, the UP.
I was wondering, do you have a connection there, or how did you pick?
No, I don't. I've never been there. I've been to Michigan, and one of the first times I went there was on a book tour, and I remember somebody asked me, have you ever been to the UP? And I said, Union Pacific? But I do know, and I've met some people from the UP who are a little wild, you know, and definitely, you know, don't really consider themselves as part of the rest of Michigan. They're on their own, and I kind of like that attitude. Are you from Michigan? So when you just, are you one of these Michiganders who, when you say, where are you from in Michigan, you hold your hand up and go, here, I'm over here? Yeah.
Is fishing part of the appeal also? Is there
Up there, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very remote area, a lot of hunting, a lot of wilderness, a lot of cabins. You know, it's the least populated part of Michigan, but also the wildest. I'd love to go there. I plan to go there someday.
CJ lives to fish. Writing is just a sideline. And so I thought that maybe that's one reason you were dreaming of the Upper Peninsula.
I've been invited to go fishing there. I'm going to do it someday. Yes?
Where does Joe get his sense of integrity?
Where does Joe get his sense of integrity? That's a good question, because he kind of had a rough childhood. I don't know. I think he just wants to always do the right thing, and luckily he's got good support in that department from his wife Mary Beth, and I think he, like maybe me, when you've got 3 daughters, you don't want to let them down, and sometimes I think he does things and takes steps just because he doesn't want anybody disappointed in him. Does that answer your question?
Doesn't Mary Beth play a role in that too?
Yeah, I said because he's got the support of his wife who, you know, keeps him on the right track. Absolutely. Yes?
Do you know the total number of vehicles that Joe has?
Do I know the total? You know, I don't. That's another thing. When I figured out his age, I'll have to go back and find out how many vehicles has he smashed up or lost. He hasn't in the last couple of books because I've gotten kind of sensitive to that. I don't want to do it every time. And sometimes it's not his fault. You know, it's because like in the book that takes place in Yellowstone, he parks in a parking lot, and when he comes back to his truck, a geyser has erupted through the parking lot and destroyed the truck. It's not his fault. He didn't do that on purpose. Yes?
How many more Joe Pickett TV series do we expect?
Well, they wrapped up. There's two seasons. It's on Amazon Prime and Paramount Plus. Thanks, Barbara. There's talk about bringing it back, but there's nothing I can announce yet. So, in the future, who knows? I answer a lot of questions about the TV shows, Big Sky and Joe Pickett. And the way my wife and I kind of look at it is, it's not the pinnacle for every writer to have a TV series based on their stuff. It's helpful, it's great, but it's not as big as it used to be. Publishing, at a certain level is a lot more lucrative than entertainment. It didn't always be that way, but it is now. When you think of how many streamers and networks and shows there are, it's just really changed the economics of it. But where a TV show is really helpful is if you consider it not as not a perfect representation of your book, because it's never going to happen, but as 1 hour commercials for your books in general. So there's a lot of new readers who've come to the books because they saw the shows, and that's invaluable, and it's really helped. I mean, each book, it's in my career, has outsold the last one, and in the last few years, I think that's partly because new readers come on board, and part of that is the TV shows.
Way back early, when Colin Dexter was writing Morse, many of you probably have watched Morse on TV. I could not give away his books. They really weren't all that interesting. And then they decided to do Morse and set it at Oxford, which is in many ways the main character and so forth. And Colin's books just took off, you know. So sometimes TV is actually better than the books. But the other rule to remember is no matter how bad the TV might be, the books are still the books. You know, the books are not corrupted, so you can watch something and think, we just watched the Cormoran Strike, the most recent one, which is a really bizarre, it's called The Ink Black Heart, and it's about gamers and other stuff.
Yeah, I don't know that.
It's really creepy. Ink Black Heart, I think, is 900 pages or something like that, and the TV series is, I don't remember, 6 or something. But they're really very different. So you can take the books and enjoy them, and then you can do the TV, and even if you know the basic story structure, it's a really different story. And I think it's important to remember that there are two different forms of storytelling. You know, so you can't translate a book directly into television or the movies. It's always going to be different.
Right, they're always going to, and if anything remains of your book in the episodes, you know, I'm always happy about that. And you know, certain lines will come through, and I'll go, oh, I like that line. I know where they got that. But you know, some writers like Michael Connelly, Harlan Coben certainly get very involved in the series that's based on their books. They're on the set. And I opted not to do that for a couple reasons. One, most of them were taking place during COVID when I couldn't hardly travel or go anywhere. And the other reason is I didn't want to be intimately involved with that. It's a collaborative process on a set. I would just be one of the many voices in trying to advocate for things. It's incredibly boring to sit in a tent with headphones and watch them do the same scene 13 times in a day. And so it's not enjoyable. And so I didn't, you know, the way I look at it is my job, because I was an executive producer on both, meant I provide the source material and I cash the check. And I don't try to get intimately involved with casting or writing or anything like that, because you'd have to be there. You can't, things change all the time. I remember on one set, I heard an actress, I was watching and I heard her say, my character wouldn't say this. And I was sitting there going, lady, I invented you. You don't know what your character would say. Ugh, you know, and I thought, I gotta leave this place fast.
Having said that, I will tell you that CJ, when he finally got to Alberta, where they are filming the Joe Picketts, first thing he did was send me a photo of his personalized director's chair.
Yeah.
Did you keep the chair?
I didn't keep it, no. I had a trailer too, you know.
You did?
Yeah, for one day. They just slide your name in there and make you feel important.
Well, I sort of thought you would like pack up the chair, fold it, you know, and bring it home.
I should have.
You should have.
I thought I'd be going back. I thought there'd be season 3.
Ah, okay. Well, there we are. Sorry, another question? There's one way over there.
In previous books, you bring in elements of current events like Antifa or Bitcoin mining, anything like that in Battle Mountain?
Not to that degree, no. Because it's based on this real well, actually, I have to backtrack from that. Yes, there is. Without, I don't want to reveal what it is, but there's a motivation of a pretty big character in the book that's based on a real incident, military, that occurred just a few years ago. And I spoke to some special operators about it, got their feelings. They were very bitter about, well, it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, how bitter these soldiers were on how that ended. So that provides a major motivation for one of the characters. So that, in that regard, yes. Yes?
Since you do about a book a year or so,
Yes.
how do you reconcile that timing with also being unencumbered so that your ideas can develop organically and not being forced? Or how do you reconcile both of those pieces?
I don't know how I do. How do I reconcile that? I'm not sure that I do. I just always, at the end of, whenever I finish a book, I usually have 2 or 3 possible next books in mind. And then I discuss those 3 possible ideas with my editor, and we go with our consensus, and we go on. I never plan very far ahead. I just don't. I think for a couple reasons. One, I think I'm a reader too, and I think you can tell if somebody's withholding information that's going to be in a future book. I think that's cheating. I think you should put everything into every book and then figure out the next one. But also, I don't have a long character arc. Joe Pickett is not going to get in a fight with Moriarty at Rickenback Falls at some point and be gone. I have no idea where it's going. I just go book to book to book.
Right, but we just talked about the fact that Sheridan has taken over the falconry thing right now from
Nate.
Nate, thank you. Senior moment there. And so it would be kind of silly to waste that opportunity. At some point, Sheridan should be able to do something important on her own. If Joe is laid up or if Joe gets sick or, whatever it is, you could actually put Sheridan front and center because you've laid a foundation for her.
Yep. Yeah, it can go all sorts of different directions, and in the next book it kind of does. Yes, sir.
Some of your characters have names of real people, such as Dennis or Keith Guys, and I'm sure some of them are fake names. How do you determine if you're going to use a real name or a fake name?
About now, it's almost like 80% of the names in the books are real names. And that's because I donate your name in a CJ Box book items to charities, primarily in Wyoming, but also the Mountain West and sometimes nationally. And people bid on the right to have their name in a book. Or they can designate a name, doesn't have to be theirs. And but they have to sign a release that says they have no editorial control of how that name is used. And I do put in the release that it's pretty likely that name is going to be a bad guy or a victim, because that's most of the new characters. So a lot of them are local names, and I've got the governor of Wyoming and his wife had both bought character names before it was the governor and the first lady, and they're in the books, and it's fun to do because it's kind of an in-joke. But if I don't have a character name that's a real name, I still will go to the PRCA, Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, media handbook, because cowboy names are the greatest names. That's why people name Stetson and Rope and things like that, because they just have great names.
So some books ago, I got my advanced reading copy, or maybe it was a manuscript, and I was a little busy, so I didn't read it right away. But then when I finally got into it, to my amazement, the bad guy coming up from Mexico checked into the Hotel Valley Ho.
Yeah.
Scottsdale was his killing field, and they rendezvoused at the Poison Pen. And so I wrote to CJ and I went, and he said, I thought you were never going to read it.
Yeah. It's true.
Right.
Yeah.
However, notice that he never asked permission.
Yeah. No.
No, that was so much fun. I still remember how
Easier to
surprised-
apologize and ask permission. Yeah.
No, it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. It's fun to see yourself in a book. It really is. Years ago, there was an author named Judy Van Giesen who wrote some wonderful books set in New Mexico. I just love them. She was kind of a contemporary of Tony Hillerman. But she was writing books set in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and she had a woman protagonist, and she had a boyfriend called the Kid who was an auto mechanic. Great character. But anyway, at some point in one of the stories, they stumbled across an abandoned car in the desert, and so she calls it in, and there's the license plate number, and I'm reading along, and there's the license plate number, and I thought, that's really familiar. So I went out and looked at my car. And there it was, my license plate number. And so I wrote to her and I said, Judy, and she said, I knew you wouldn't mind. So it does happen, right?
Yeah, I
Have
like
you
that.
ever inadvertently, because you probably don't have this problem, but there are a number of writers who've really run into trouble with phone numbers. Because, even if you make one up, the odds are good that it's going to be somebody's actual phone number. But you don't have a lot of phones in your books.
Well, I've got a lot of phones, but I just say they punched up the
Okay.
name as opposed to the number.
But think about
No.
Greg Hurwitz, for example, you know, where he has, I'm trying to remember what it is called, you know, the Nowhere Man, or I mean, there's something. And so to solve the problem, he took out the phone number as a real phone number and had his audio book recorder record a message. So, hello, you've reached, you know, or however that goes. How can we help? Which I thought was a brilliant solution to
That's
the
pretty
problem.
clever.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Any more? Well, there's one in the back, yes?
Will you utilize any of the current events, like job cuts that are happening with game wardens and rangers that we're seeing pop up on social media as far as
Do I incorporate current events that happen with rangers and game wardens? Yes. I try to as much as I can. I continue to go on ride-alongs with local game wardens, and I generally, you know, they always kind of want to impress me somehow with something, but it usually is like throwaway stuff that they'll say that I'll get really interested in. A couple of years ago, and I actually put this into Stormwatch, that book. The game warden in our local area was telling me how elk antler poaching, you know, sheds are really a big deal because they're very valuable. And there's a certain season where you can go out and get them. But there were guys on snowmobiles who were herding elk into really dense timber with the snowmobiles and panic them. So they'd go in and their antlers would fall off when they hit branches. And then they'd gather them all up out of season. And I thought, what a weird but cool thing to put in the book. So I go a lot on some of the things that I hear from them and real incidents. Did that answer your question?
I was thinking more along the political impact of a White House level and how it is.
Political impact of a White House? Well, I mean, game wardens are state employees. So there might be some impact on federal employees like Forest Service, but not on state employees. They work for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department.
All right. Was Wolfpack the name of the poison pen book?
Yes, it was Wolfpack.
Okay, I had to look it up because I had forgotten it, but if you're interested in reading it, if you missed it, it's the book called Wolfpack,
Yep.
which is really fun. Scottsdale, right?
Yes.
So I've noticed in your books that you don't seem to be a fan of the feds at all. Will there ever be a character that's a federal officer that you will like or that will be a good person?
This book. I try to accurately portray, and I put it in the book. You know, Wyoming is 50% owned by the federal government, meaning it's run, half of the state is run by different federal agencies, and they all have their own law enforcement. And when the administration changes, no matter which direction it goes, everything changes every 4 years. Which makes it really tough for people to plan or develop things. So there's a lot of tension between people on the ground and the federal government. In the West here, it's probably, you know, there was a Wall Street Journal feature on me a few weeks ago, and although it didn't get in the article very much, the reporter who was talking to me couldn't believe that half the state was owned by the federal government. He lives in New York. He's never encountered federal land, public land. And the next time he called to check up on things, he said, you know what, I looked it up and you're right. That's really weird. But most people outside of the West don't realize that. So there are just a lot of conflicts for that reason, and that's why that comes across.
You know, I'd have to look it up, but Arizona has a small amount of private land because it's federal land, it's state land, it's reservation. So we don't have, that's kind of why we have these couple of big cities and then a few small ones, you know. So it's not unusual.
Nevada is, I think, 75% federal, that state, and that's a lot.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well.
Well, Barbara, thank you, and thank you all very much.